government's launching a new campaign today to persuade parents that it's safe to send children back to school next month.
But with Downing Street warning pubs could shut next month in order to allow schools to open, many are questioning just how safe it is for kids to be back in the classroom. Joining us from Buckinghamshire, we have former World Health Organization cancer expert, Professor Carol Sikora, who thinks the reopening of schools is a positive step. And from North London, we have Independent Sage member Professor Susan Mickey, who believes it's not safe enough to send pupils back to class. Professor Sikora, if I can come to you first on this. So you think schools just got to open no matter what, despite the fact that some people have grave concerns about the safety of all of that?
I think we have to go ahead. Now's the time to do it. And if we look at what's happened around the world, 20 countries have had the schools open. Sweden, of course, kept the schools open throughout the pandemic. That's a slight exception. But if we look at Israel, which opened on the 17th of May, very carefully controlled opening of schools, very carefully monitored. There's been no problems. And I think what we have to do is get started. There are three groups here, the children, the teachers and the community. All have needs and all can be monitored. And the College of Paediatricians and Child Health, which represents 1,500 paediatricians and child doctors around the country, actually wrote to the Secretary of State for Education saying it's time for the children to get things moving. But we've got to monitor it. I fully agree.
Yeah, it is important to get children back to school, but there are fears about what that will do for the transmission rate. There's this study that's been released by Imperial College London found that the full opening of schools could drive the R rate up by as much as 0.5%. And we already think that we're either just below R or at 1 or at 1 at the moment. So isn't this going to have a big effect on the transmission rate? Do you think that other things should be locked down to enable schools to reopen fully?
Absolutely not. I mean, we're looking at the third thing, the community transmission and the R factor in the community. I think we've got to accept we can't go back. We've got to keep things going. We've got to get the places of work open, transport open. It is open. We can't go back on that. And to close the pubs would be a retrograde step. I think what we've got to do is just monitor it. And we now have the tools at long last. After the debacle of Public Health England, we at last have the tools to monitor what's going on in the community. And we can follow not just the R rate, we can follow the virus, we can check for it, we can trace it. We've got the apparatus in place, which we didn't have even a month ago.
Do we though? I mean, is Test, Track and Trace up to speed enough to be able to see us through this? Because there are criticisms about the fact that it's not able to get in contact with as many people as it needs to make it work effectively.
It's not world class, there's no doubt. That word, horrible word, world class, that we hear all the time from politicians. It's certainly not that, but it's, in my opinion, it's good enough. I'm an oncologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, and my interest in all this is to get cancer services rolling again. And we have exactly the same problem with schools. If you start welcoming cancer patients, you get an influx of community transmission.
OK, well, let's go to Professor Susan Mickey now. You have concerns, however, and don't think it is safe enough to be bringing children back to reopen schools fully.
I actually said that it depends on the area of the country. In the UK at the moment, Sage last week said they couldn't be confident that any area of the country had an R below 1. Last week, we also, on several days running, had more than 1,000 confirmed new cases a day, which is above the government's threshold. And we know that in some areas of the country, the transmission rates are so high that restrictions have had to be imposed. In those areas of the country, whilst there is not a functioning test, trace and isolate system, I'm sorry, I have to profoundly disagree with Professor Sikora. Just look at the data. The tracing is way below what's needed. And there's been no data published whatsoever on isolation, and we know it's not happening. So where we have the transmission rate creeping up as it is, we just look at the rest of the world. What you said about Israel, I'm sorry, is not true. They've had to reclose schools when they've opened it in Israel and in many countries. The countries where schools have been opened successfully, one has to look at why. And they have more teachers where they can have shift systems. They have requisitioned other spaces so that they can have half the numbers in the school. We haven't done either of those things. So if the government can learn lessons from the rest of the world and not open up really risky places like children's soft play, casinos, bowling alleys, and also just for the next few weeks, whilst the weather hopefully will be good enough, close down the indoor pubs and bars, which have been shown to be really risky. Then we have a situation which will be safe for all our children to go back to school, which is everybody's priority.
But just to clarify that the track and trace system, yes, OK, everyone will probably agree it's not worked brilliantly, but it's had some success. I mean, the fact that we've highlighted areas in Blackburn, in Leicester, parts of Greater Manchester, they've got hotspots, would indicate it is working to a certain extent, and we know some of those local councils have then employed their own local sort of strategies as well. So there is some success. Yeah. So based on just even that level of success, you don't think that we're even in any position to open up the schools?
That's not what I said. I said we should be opening up schools, but we should be opening up schools safely. In order to do that, we need a well-performing test, trace and isolate system. Ours is a shambles. And the reason that local authorities have had to step in and spend their scant resources on doing their own one is because the national commercially driven call centre one is not working. Just look at the data.
But they have got their own local ones in place. But OK, but what about the schools itself? I mean, do you think that the schools themselves are prepared for this?
I think it really varies according to the nature of the buildings. Are they large enough to space children, to have really good ventilation, which is key to stop transmission? And are they in communities where the community transmission is low? If the answer to all those is yes, then absolutely fine. If they're in a community where the transmission's high, where there's no good local test, trace and isolate system in place, and where they have buildings where children are going to be crowded and it's difficult to ventilate, then it's really risky. And it's not so much for the children. The children themselves are unlikely to get ill, but the children are, especially secondary school children, who transmit at the rate that adults do. The problem is, a virus gets into the school, it gets massively amplified because children are in close proximity with each other. It then goes out many, many times into the community where there are vulnerable people who then can become ill or even die.
And just briefly, Professor Sakura, obviously Professor Mickey disagreed with you on a number of points, but she says that, it will be risky in some areas to reopen.
Look, life is a risk, and getting out of this pandemic is far more difficult than getting into the pandemic and closing things. We've got to take the risk. We've got to accept it. It's not a great risk because we can monitor it. We know where the schools are. We can monitor the teachers. We can monitor the parents. Of course, there's all sorts of safety things, and some schools would be much easier to adapt to those than other schools. But we've got to try. For the sake of the children, we've got to try. It's their education. It's going to avoid child abuse. It's going to keep nutrition going for the deprived. We've just got to do it. It's crazy to say, it can't be done and we've got to close other things. We've just got to move as a society forward to try and get through this together. Okay. And we have the tools. They may not be perfect.